Grace and peace to you from the risen and reigning Jesus Christ. And welcome to NCCP Anywhere. I'm Dave Stawick, the NCCP visiting homilist. And as usual, my anywhere, at least here online, is our nation's capital. So greetings to you from Washington, D.C. and our house here on Capitol Hill. I'm looking forward to being at NCCP at the Bixlers and Grace churches this weekend. As we continue on in this month of November, a month of significant dates and observations, as Pastor John talked about last week, we started out in our church month with All Saints Sunday last month, of course, and we remembered all of those who shared this life in faith and are now in the caring love of our God. And we'll end the month with Christ the King Sunday at the last of the month, that as we will then move on into the new year of the church year in Advent. Of course, we'll celebrate Thanksgiving in some form or fashion later this month. Last week, on the national level, we had Election Day, and I trust that everybody survived that just fine, even as votes are still being counted and legal challenges are being considered. And of course, this coming week, we're going to be celebrating a national holiday of Veterans Day that is very important, and it is very special to my heart because of the people in my life who've been associated with the military. In our Grow Guide here for November, Catherine has listed the names of the veterans in our congregation. And so we honor those men and women and those who might not have been listed as well, who are visiting. We thank you for your service, your devotion to your country, and indeed, we salute you. Military service and military life were important to me because my parents were both in the Air Force. I grew up in an Air Force town where my dad continued to work as a civilian. And going to school with kids of many backgrounds was a blessing for me, and it was something that was very unusual for a kid who grew up in a very agricultural part of central Illinois that I talked about last time I was with you here on NCCP Anywhere, talking about agriculture. Well, this week I get to talk about the military. Also in my family, my Uncle Dwayne, who was my godfather, was a Marine. I had three uncles and a cousin who were in the Army, and I've had many friends who are in the military or were in the military. A special one I want to give a shout out to today that I think of especially is my friend Marie, who's kind of a family member, sort of like a niece of mine. She's young enough to be my niece anyway, who was in the Coast Guard. I met Marie when she was here in DC going to school at Catholic University studying architecture, and she went to graduate school in Chicago at Illinois Institute of Technology, and she is now living with her husband Julian in Texas, and she is an architect in Austin. So to Marie, I say thank you for your service. I love you, and Semper Paratus. Our salute to veterans fits in very marvelously with our preaching theme and focus at NCCP this month on the book of Nehemiah, and the theme for the month, this stone. And I'm going to ask you to consider the intersection of Nehemiah with the history and mission of our armed services, because I think that there are some very interesting comparisons there. First, a brief word of review about Nehemiah. As Pastor John explained last week, he was among those Hebrew people who were expelled from Jerusalem probably in the 6th century before the life of Jesus. The Babylonians moved out most of the people and severely damaged the sacred temple and the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah was taken captive, but he was he became a servant to the king of the nation that had overrun Jerusalem, what is now Iraq, now known as Iraq. Who recognized that Nehemiah was a very gifted public servant, a capable administrator and leader. And so the king knew that Nehemiah, though, was very aggrieved about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he actually ordered and equipped Nehemiah, his trusted servant, to go back to Jerusalem to oversee the rebuilding of Nehemiah's beloved city. Now, it's important to take note of what Nehemiah was not. He was not a priest. He was not a prophet. He was not part of an aristocracy. He was a common man who was very gifted in his attributes and abilities, and a man who had an extraordinary faith. Nehemiah, as I said, wasn't a prophet, but he had about as direct a line to God as you can imagine. Through prayer and repentance and conversation, he discerned God's will, and with the earthly permission of the king, Nehemiah had the mission of overseeing the rebuilding of Jerusalem. That effort is detailed in the text of this month's series, which include rebuilding the walls, putting those stones back in place for the wall of Jerusalem and the temple. Hence, we have that theme of this stone. So the point is that Nehemiah was gifted and able, but he wasn't privileged by this world's standards, or the standards of his time. But he became a great leader, a great commander in the task of his time. And that leads us to the honoring of our veterans this week in a couple of very important senses. First, some of our nation's greatest military commanders were cut from the same kind of cloth as Nehemiah. They had the same type of experience and background. Now, I think of three men of very humble circumstances who rose to be great leaders, not by nobility or title, again, but by their efforts and their devotion. The first I think of is Dwight David Eisenhower, the great Army general, and of course later former president, but we think of him as General Eisenhower. He was born in Texas. He was raised in Kansas in a family of modern means. And he couldn't afford to go to college, or the family couldn't afford to send him to go to college, or his brothers. So he and his brother Edgar worked up a plan. And that was that they were going to trade off. And one year, Edgar would go to college and Dwight would work to support them both. And the next year, they would change places. The other one would go to school and the other one would work. So they had really an 8-year plan for making it through school and paying for it themselves. But a high school friend of Dwight's suggested that he try to go to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, the U.S. Naval Academy, where he could get a free education. As it turned out, though, Dwight was too old to get in to Annapolis, but he did meet the qualifications for West Point. So he went to the United States Military Academy and went on to the Army and went on to be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during World War II. Now, another example is from the Navy, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Now, Nimitz was also born in Texas, and his father died before Chet, as he was known, was born. Also a family of modest means. He couldn't afford college either, but he was interested in military service, so he looked at the service academies. Now, interestingly enough, Nimitz's first choice was to go to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, but his congressman's nomination for West Point had already been taken. But the congressman did have a nomination slot for Annapolis. So that's why Nimitz went to the Naval Academy, into the Navy, and on to be the chief of naval operations, the top officer of the Navy in World War II. And a more modern example is the new chief of staff of the United States Air Force, General Charles Q. Brown, known as CQ. Now, he was not from a wealthy or privileged family either, although his family was an Army officer. And Brown did not go to a prestigious service academy. he went to Texas Tech University and was in Air Force ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Corps, and he almost quit during his first year in ROTC. And that's where my story and General Brown's diverge. I was in ROTC for my first year, but because of a change of majors and to get some academic difficulties squared around, I left ROTC. He continued, became a pilot, flew F-16s in combat, and then went into several command positions. And last August, General Brown became the first African American chief of a branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. When General Brown took command, he said, "You can expect my leadership to be framed by the same 4 tenets I have used throughout my career. Execute at a high standard, be disciplined in execution, pay attention to details, and have fun." Well, I'm not sure about the fun part, but otherwise, General Brown's philosophy sounds a lot like Nehemiah's. Pay attention to details. Pay attention to your job, to this stone before you. That was Nehemiah's philosophy in the task of rebuilding the ransacked Jerusalem. And if you think about it, that's what the military is all about, is specialization, right from the top down, in every service. The Navy projecting sea power, and also delivering the Marines, the Marine Corps to take new ground, the Army to control the land, the Air Force to assert air superiority, the Coast Guard to, well, guard the coasts and the inland waterways. And that same specialization is carried out within the services. If you take the example of my father and mother, they were both in the Air Force, as I said. Their career field was meteorology. But even within weather, there were branches, each that was dependent on the other. There were the equipment technicians who installed and maintained all the equipment to make the weather observations that my father did when he was in the service, and he was later in the school teaching meteorologists in the town where I grew up, Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois. So that the weather observers used the equipment that they were given to take their hourly observations that were then put out across the teletype link that literally went around the country, around the world. And the data that they generated were then used by the weather forecasters to develop their forecasts for 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours in advance. They each had to do their jobs. And in many cases, they couldn't do their jobs unless the others did theirs. Finally, thinking about the military and having this opportunity to preach on Nehemiah, I play a game of what if. What if things had been different in my life? I've sometimes thought that my highest and best calling would probably have been a chaplain in the Air Force. And I actually looked into it while I was in seminary, but as I expected, fact of the matter was, I was too old. By the time I had started seminary, I was already too old to join the Air Force Chaplains Corps, to have been done with seminary and ordained. I try not to look back, rather to look forward to the task that's been set before me now in ministry. And that task, this stone, my stone, is to be with you here at NCCP. And I'll do my best in that task to interpret scripture faithfully, preach clearly, and be the most able assistant that I can to Pastor Melissa, and Pastor John, and Pastor Jerry. And also to try to contribute as best I can to the life of our parishes. So the military that we celebrate on this Veterans Day week gives us an excellent representation of the kind of dedication to a task and concentration on detail and trust in others and faith in God that are all examined and contained in the book of Nehemiah. And as we consider how we can follow the biblical example, dealing with the challenges and the holy tasks in our lives, I suggest we consider again that command philosophy of Air Force General Brown that I mentioned earlier. earlier. As General Brown said, execute at a high standard, be disciplined in execution, pay attention to details, and have fun. Good direction from an able leader to incorporate into our secular life and our faith life in the spirit of Nehemiah. May it be so.